It was the worst blizzard Cedar Ridge had seen in decades. A stranger collapsed on my porch, bleeding into the snow. Neighbors whispered I'd broken the rules by helping him. I stayed calm and let them talk. Something in Deborah's eyes flickered, fear, not anger. She started making calls before dawn. By morning, my whole life was about to change forever. My name is Margaret Ellison, 74 years old, a retired third-grade teacher and widow of 31 years. I raised 2 children in this house on Larkspur Lane, buried my husband Walter under the maple tree out back, and never once imagined my quiet street would become a battlefield. Cedar Ridge Estates was supposed to be peaceful, manicured lawns, holiday lights, potlucks in June. I loved my neighbors, mostly. I loved my little house with its creaky porch swing. I never wanted trouble. The night the snow turned the whole world white and silent. Our HOA had always had rules, mailbox colors, lawn heights, the usual small-town fussiness. Harmless, mostly. But 2 years ago, a woman named Deborah Whitcomb became board president, and something in the air changed. Rules stopped feeling like guidelines and started feeling like weapons. Deborah was sharp, polished, always in tailored blazers even to walk her dog. She ran meetings like military briefings, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for violations. People respected her efficiency at first. I noticed something colder underneath it, something that watched more than it listened. She fined the Hendersons for leaving a kiddie pool out 2 days too long. She sent a letter to old Mr. Abernathy about his unsightly wind chimes. Small things, each one defensible on its own. Together, they painted a picture of a woman who needed control more than community. I stayed out of her way. My porch swept, my flag properly folded at dusk. I had learned, at 74, that the quiet path was usually the wise one. Still, I watched Deborah tighten her grip on our little street, meeting by meeting. My late husband Walter had been one of the original developers of Cedar Ridge. Back when it was just cornfields and a dream. He'd written some of the founding bylaws himself. I still had his old binder in the hall closet. Yellowed pages nobody had opened in 20 years. Deborah didn't know that. Or did. To them, I was just the old widow at the end of the lane who baked too much zucchini bread and waved at everyone from her porch. They underestimated quiet people. They always do, don't they? That winter, Deborah pushed a new rule through: no overnight guests without prior board approval. Effective immediately. For community safety. Nobody voted on it publicly. It simply appeared in the newsletter one Tuesday, tucked between a reminder about recycling bins and a bake sale flyer. My daughter Claire called from Denver, furious. "Mom, that's insane. What if there's an emergency?" I told her not to worry, that surely no reasonable person would enforce something so cold during an actual crisis. I believed that, foolishly, the way you believe rain won't fall on your parade. Deborah's son, Tyler, had moved back home that year after some trouble nobody discussed openly. Rumors floated, a business that failed, a marriage that ended badly. Deborah kept him close, kept him quiet, kept the curtains of her house drawn earlier than anyone else's on the street. I noticed Tyler sometimes on his motorcycle, roaring out late at night, helmet under his arm like he wanted to be seen without being recognized. for a woman so obsessed with rules, to have a son who broke curfew regularly. I filed the thought away and said nothing. The town itself sat at the base of the mountains, the kind of place where winter arrived like a held breath and then let go all at once. Snowplows were unreliable out past the county line. Power flickered every hard freeze. We all knew storms here could turn dangerous fast. The National Weather Service issued a blizzard warning that Thursday, the worst in 11 years. They said, with winds strong enough to close the interstate. Deborah sent an email reminding everyone to move trash bins indoors. Not one word about checking on elderly residents or stranded travelers. I remember thinking, as I watched the sky darken early that afternoon, that something about the air felt different. Heavier. Before a real storm. An old woman's barometer more reliable than any app on Claire's phone. I brought in extra firewood, just in case. By 4 o'clock the snow was already sideways, slashing against my windows like static on an old television. The wind screamed down Larkspur Lane, rattling the shutters Walter had installed himself 30 years ago. I lit candles, made tea, and settled in to wait the storm out. Around 6, the power died completely. The whole street went dark except for a few battery lanterns glowing weakly in windows. I lit an extra candle by the door, an old habit from my mother, who always said a light in the window meant a welcome for anyone lost. I heard it before I saw it, a low mechanical growl fighting the wind, then a sudden silence, then a heavy thud against my porch railing. My heart jumped into my throat. At my age you learn to move slowly, but something in that sound made me move fast. I opened the door into a wall of snow and wind, and there on my porch steps lay a man, unconscious, half buried already, blood dark against the white beneath him. A motorcycle lay on its side at the end of my driveway, while still spinning slowly in the wind. I didn't think about rules, or fines, or newsletters. I thought about Walter, who once told me the measure of a person is what they do when no one's watching and the cost is real. I grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was heavier than I expected, dead weight in soaked leather, but adrenaline is a strange gift to the old. I dragged him inside, kicked the door shut against the howling wind, and knelt beside him on my kitchen floor, checking for breath the way old nursing instincts remember. He was breathing, shallow but steady. A gash above his eyebrow bled freely, and his left leg sat at a wrong angle beneath torn denim. I pressed a clean dish towel to his forehead, propped his leg with couch cushions, and dialed for an ambulance that never came. The line was busy. Then dead storm had taken the towers too. I was on my own with a bleeding stranger. No power, no phone, and a blizzard outside that showed no sign of mercy. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely, thoroughly afraid. He woke around midnight, disoriented, muttering something about the Hendrick kid and ice on the overpass. I gave him water, wrapped him in every blanket I owned, and told him he was safe now, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true for either of us. By morning the storm had softened to a lazy drift of flakes, and pale sunlight caught the ice-glazed trees like something out of a postcard. My guest, he told me his name was Dean, slept fitfully on my couch, leg elevated, color slowly returning to his face. I finally got a signal around 9 and called for real help. The paramedics who arrived looked at Dean's leg and whistled low. Compound fracture. Ma'am. Another few hours out there and hypothermia would have finished the job. I felt something settle in my chest. Relief, mixed with pride. That relief didn't last long. By the time the ambulance pulled away, I noticed Deborah standing at the end of my driveway in her monogrammed parka, arms crossed, watching with an expression I can only describe as calculating. She didn't ask if I was all right. She asked who he was. A stranger. Deborah. He crashed in the blizzard. I helped him. I expected relief. Maybe even praise for a neighbor who'd saved a life in a storm. Instead, her mouth thinned into a hard line. "You do know about the guest policy," she said. "Don't you, Margaret?" I laughed. Actually laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. "It's for community safety," she said, pulling out her phone to photograph my porch, my driveway, the motorcycle still lying on its side. "This is exactly the kind of thing the board needs to review." Deborah. The man nearly died. There was no ambulance. No signal. I did what any decent person would do. She only nodded slowly, the way people do when they've already decided something and are simply waiting for you to finish talking so they can move to the next step. Word spread fast on the neighborhood app. By noon, half the street had chimed in, some supportive, most curious, a few oddly hostile. Who was that man? Why was a biker on Larkspur Lane? Isn't Margaret's guest policy violation a safety concern for the rest of us? I recognized Deborah's fingerprints on those last comments even without her name attached. She had a way of seeding worry into a community, letting neighbors do her dirty work for her while she stood back looking blameless. Hands folded, the picture of civic responsibility and concern. My neighbor Ruth, a kind widow 2 doors down, stopped by that afternoon with a casserole and a warning. "Watch yourself with Deborah, Margaret." She got the Kowalskis fined $800 over a garden gnome dispute last spring. She doesn't forget, and she doesn't forgive. I thanked Ruth, ate the casserole, and told myself it would blow over. Surely no reasonable board would punish a woman for saving a stranger's life in a blizzard. Surely there were limits to how petty, how vindictive, one homeowners association president could truly be. 2 days later, an official letter arrived, embossed with the Cedar Ridge Estate seal. Notice of alleged bylaw violation, unauthorized overnight guest. Section 14.3. Attached was a $500 fine and a demand that I appear before the board within 10 days to explain myself. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times, waiting for the anger to arrive. Instead came something colder, steadier, the particular clarity that comes to people who have raised children, buried husbands, and learned that unfairness rarely announces itself before it arrives at your door. My daughter Claire wanted to drive down immediately, guns blazing, lawyer in tow. I told her to wait. "First," I said. 40 years teaching 3rd grade had taught me plenty about handling bullies. You never let them see you flinch first. I visited Dean in the hospital that week. Brought him a slice of my apple pie and a get-well card the Henderson's kids had drawn. His leg was in a heavy cast, propped on pillows, but his eyes were sharp, grateful, and I noticed carefully watchful. "Ma'am, you saved my life out there," he said quietly. "Least I can do is make sure this doesn't cost you anything." I waved him off. Told him not to worry about an old woman's paperwork problems. He nodded, but something in his expression told me he wasn't done thinking about it. I hadn't yet learned who Dean really was. To me, he was simply the stranger who'd nearly died on my porch steps. A man with kind eyes and a crooked, apologetic smile. I had no idea the leather vest folded in his duffel bag would matter to anyone but him. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 7 sharp, at the community clubhouse. I spent the days before it rereading Walter's old binder of bylaws, sipping tea at the kitchen table where he used to do the same, decades ago, before any of this began. Something in that binder caught my eye, a clause about emergency shelter provisions during declared weather events, written in Walter's own careful handwriting on a page nobody had touched since 1994. I read it twice, feeling something between hope and disbelief bloom quietly in my chest. I said nothing to Claire, nothing to Ruth, nothing to anyone. I simply photocopied the page, tucked it into my purse, and decided that if Deborah Whitcomb wanted a fight over an old woman's kindness, she was going to get one she hadn't planned for at all. Tuesday arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp blue sky that follows a hard storm like an apology. I dressed carefully, my good navy cardigan, the pearl earrings Walter gave me for our 30th anniversary, and walked into that clubhouse with my chin exactly level. The room was fuller than usual, word having spread about the biker incident. I saw curious faces, sympathetic faces, and Deborah at the head table, gavel in hand, looking every bit the small-town monarch presiding over her modest but absolute kingdom. She smiled at me. "Margaret," she began, voice honeyed for the audience, "we're not here to punish kindness. We're here to discuss process. Rules exist to protect everyone equally." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, the kind of nodding people do when they haven't yet decided what they truly think. I stood when called, folder in hand, and told the story plainly: the blizzard, the crash, the blood on the snow, the dead phone lines, the ambulance that couldn't come for hours. I watched faces soften as I spoke. I watched Deborah's smile hold, brittle and unmoving. "Regardless of circumstances," she said crisply when I finished, "Section 14.3 makes no exception for emergencies. The board must apply rules consistently, or what's the point of having them at all?" A few heads nodded. A few looked distinctly uncomfortable with where this was heading. I opened my folder and laid Walter's photocopied page on the table. "Actually, Deborah, there is an exception. Section 22.7. Emergency shelter provisions during declared weather events. Written into our original bylaws in 1994. Perhaps the board simply forgot it existed." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has landed in the middle of a conversation everyone thought they understood. Deborah's eyes flicked to the page, then to me, then back to the page, calculating something behind that composed face. "That's an outdated provision," she said finally. Too quickly. "It hasn't been formally reaffirmed in the current bylaws." I asked, gently, whether any bylaw needed reaffirming to remain valid, or whether it simply remained valid until someone bothered to remove it through a proper vote. Treasurer Fran Doyle, a nervous woman who rarely spoke at meetings, cleared her throat. Margaret's not wrong. Nothing in our records shows that section was ever formally struck. I can check the archive." Deborah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Almost. We'll table this," Deborah announced, gavel tapping sharper than necessary. "Fran will verify the archive, and we'll revisit at the next meeting." It wasn't victory, Not yet, but it was a crack, the first hairline fracture in a wall I'd assumed was solid concrete. Walking home that night under a sky full of hard, clean stars, I felt something unfamiliar stir in my chest. Not triumph. Exactly. Something quieter and steadier. The feeling of a woman who had been underestimated her whole life. Finally remembering she knew how to fight. I should have known Deborah wouldn't simply let it go. Women like her don't retreat. They regroup. 3 days later, a new notice appeared on every mailbox on Larkspur Lane. An emergency special meeting called to discuss ongoing community safety concerns related to recent events. I read between those careful, bloodless words easily enough. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. About a woman who could not tolerate being questioned in front of an audience. Especially not by the quiet old widow she'd assumed would simply fold under a little pressure. Ruth called me that evening, voice tight with worry. She's been going door to door, Margaret, telling people that biker gangs are infiltrating the neighborhood, showing photos of Dean's motorcycle like it's evidence of something. People are getting scared, and scared people vote however they're told. I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long moment. Fear, I knew from decades in a classroom, was the easiest tool to wield and the hardest to argue against with facts. Deborah wasn't fighting me with bylaws anymore. She was fighting me with a narrative. The next morning I drove to the hospital to see Dean, both to check on his recovery and, I admit, because I needed the company of someone who didn't look at me like a problem to be solved. He was sitting up now, legs still casted, watching the news. "Ma'am, I heard what's happening," he said before I'd even sat down. "One of the nurses lives on your street. Said some woman's telling everyone I'm dangerous." He didn't look angry. He looked tired, in the particular way of a man who'd heard the story about himself before. "Dean, I don't even know your last name," I admitted, embarrassed. He smiled, a little sadly. "Castillo. Staff sergeant. Retired. 2 tours overseas. These days I ride with a club called the Iron Guardians. We raise money for the Children's Hospital 2 counties over." I sat with that for a moment. The gap between what Deborah was telling the neighborhood and what actually sat in front of me. Patient and gracious and grateful. "She's calling you dangerous," I said quietly. "You nearly died saving your strength to make it to my porch instead of the ditch." Dean's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, people see the leather, the bike, and they decide who I am before I open my mouth. Usually I let it go. And peace over something as simple as human decency. That's different." That night, I lay awake turning things over. Deborah had made a critical error, though I don't think she realized it yet. She had assumed Dean was a nameless threat, easy to vilify in absentia. She hadn't counted on him having a voice, a record, and now, a reason to use both. The emergency meeting arrived on a Thursday evening. The clubhouse packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Deborah stood at the podium with a slideshow prepared, photos of motorcycles, grainy stock images of outlaw biker patches, statistics about crime rates that had nothing to do with anything real. "This isn't about Margaret specifically," she said, though her eyes found mine twice in the first 2 minutes. "This is about protecting our children, our property values, our peace of mind. We simply cannot allow unknown, unvetted individuals free access to our streets. regardless of circumstance. I watched the room's mood shift subtly as she spoke. Fear doing exactly what fear does, narrowing minds, closing hearts, making neighbors suspicious of a wounded stranger's motorcycle helmet as though it were a loaded weapon. I felt the ground beneath my careful bylaw victory start to soften. Then the clubhouse door opened, and Dean walked in on crutches, legs still casted, uniform photo tucked under one arm like a shield. The room turned to look. Deborah's slideshow clicker froze mid-click, her mouth opening and closing once before finding words again. Slower this time. Evening, folks, Dean said, voice calm and clear despite the effort it plainly took to stand there. I understand I'm the biker gang menace you've all been discussing. Thought you might like to actually meet me before deciding that. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. He told them, briefly, plainly, his service record, his club's charity work, the toy drive they ran every December for the Children's Hospital, the $14,000 they'd raised last year alone for pediatric cancer patients. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. I crashed in a blizzard because I was driving supplies to a family stranded near the county line, he said. Mrs. Her porch steps and probably saved my leg. Maybe my life. That's the crime you're all so worried about tonight. Apparently. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, exactly the kind Deborah couldn't control from behind her podium. I watched several neighbors' faces shift, embarrassment, guilt, a few outright glares directed squarely at the woman who'd spent a week painting a wounded veteran as a threat. Deborah recovered quickly. Always did. We're grateful for your service, she said smoothly. But this meeting is about policy, not personalities. The board still has an obligation to enforce our bylaws consistently, regardless of anyone's individual circumstances or backstory. Fran Doyle, the treasurer, finally spoke up from her seat at the side table. Actually, Deborah, I checked the archive like you asked. Section 22.7 was never repealed. Is still active. Was legally sheltered under a declared weather emergency. There's no violation here. Deborah's composure cracked. Just slightly. Just enough for those of us watching closely to see it. Then perhaps, she said, voice tightening, the bylaws themselves need updating. I'll draft an amendment for the next vote. A woman too rose back muttered. Just loud enough. Of course she will. The meeting ended without a formal resolution, which felt, in its own strange way, like a victory. My fine was quietly rescinded the following week. No apology attached. Just a terse form letter citing administrative review. I framed it anyway. A small, petty pleasure I allowed myself. For a few weeks, things went quiet. Dean healed. Slowly. Dropping by occasionally with coffee and updates on his recovery. Deborah kept her distance. Polite but chilly whenever we crossed paths at the mailboxes. The kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like reloading. I should have recognized that quiet for what it was. Ruth warned me again over tea one afternoon. She's not done. Margaret. Women like Deborah don't lose gracefully. They wait, and they plan, and they come back twice as hard when you least expect it. I told Ruth I appreciated the concern but felt, cautiously, that the worst had passed. The bylaws were clear. The community had seen Dean for who he really was. Surely even Deborah understood when a battle wasn't worth fighting anymore. I was wrong about that. As it turned out, spring arrived. Unusually early, the snow melting into muddy lawns and the first stubborn crocuses pushing through near my mailbox. Dean's cast came off. He started riding again. Slower routes at first, always waving when he passed my house, always stopping if I was out on the porch. We'd become, unexpectedly, something like friends, an old widow and a wounded veteran, an unlikely pair the neighborhood had started to accept, even embrace. Ruth's grandkids asked Dean about his motorcycle. The Hendersons invited him to their 4th of July barbecue. Life, quietly, moved forward. Deborah attended the barbecue too. Of course, HOA president obligations requiring her presence at every community function whether welcome or not. I watched her watch Dean and me across the yard. Expression unreadable. The calculating look I'd learned to recognize returning slowly to her face. Later that evening, I overheard her on the phone near the parking area. Voice low but sharp. I don't care what it takes. Tyler. Find something. This isn't over. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. With that call. A week later, a new notice appeared, a proposed bylaw amendment banning recreational vehicles, including motorcycles, from being parked on any residential driveway for longer than 4 consecutive hours. Curiously specific. Curiously timed. Exactly 1 motorcycle on exactly 1 street. I read the notice twice, feeling that old familiar tightness return to my chest. This wasn't about parking. This was Deborah, unable to win through bylaws, trying to legislate Dean out of existence one technicality at a time, using the machinery of small-town bureaucracy as a personal weapon. Dean took it in stride. Mostly. I'll just park a block over, he said, shrugging, though I could see the old weariness settle back into his shoulders. The exhaustion of a man who'd spent years being treated as a problem simply for existing where he wasn't wanted. I decided I wasn't going to let that stand quietly. If Deborah wanted a fight over 4 hours of driveway parking, I was more than willing. At 74 years old, with nothing but time, and a very thorough understanding of our founding bylaws, to give her one. What I didn't yet know was that this small, petty amendment was only the opening move. Deborah wasn't simply trying to inconvenience Dean anymore. She was building something, a paper trail, a narrative, a case, and I had no idea yet how far she was willing to go. The proposed amendment came up for vote at the next general meeting. 3 weeks later. I arrived early, Walter's binder in hand once more, along with a list of 31 other residents who park trucks, boats, and trailers on their driveways for far longer than 4 hours regularly. If we're going to regulate driveways, I said calmly when called upon, let's regulate them fairly. I counted. Alone has been parked for 6 days straight. Are we amending the bylaws? Or are we targeting one specific vehicle belonging to one specific person? A murmur of recognition moved through the crowd, the particular murmur of neighbors realizing, collectively, that they'd been asked to participate in something uncomfortably personal disguised as policy. Deborah's face stayed composed, but her knuckles whitened slightly against the podium's edge. This amendment applies equally to all residents, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier polish. Motorcycles pose unique noise and safety concerns that boats and trailers simply don't. Someone in the back muttered that Tyler's motorcycle was louder than any bike Dean had ever ridden. I hadn't noticed that comment's significance at the time, distracted as I was by the vote itself, which failed 19 against, 11 in favor, for abstentions. Deborah announced the results tightly and moved immediately to the next agenda item, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Walking to my car afterward, Fran Doyle caught up with me, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Margaret, be careful," she whispered. "I've seen some things in the financial records lately that don't add up. I don't want to say more here, but I think something's wrong." I asked her to elaborate, gently, but she shook her head, clearly frightened of something or someone. "Not yet." I let her go, filing the exchange away with everything else. A small stone added to a pile I hadn't yet realized was becoming a mountain. That night, Dean called to thank me for standing up at the meeting. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I appreciate it more than you know." I told him it wasn't just about him anymore. Something about Deborah's behavior felt bigger than one motorcycle, one driveway, one grudge. Over the following weeks, small strange things began accumulating. My trash pickup was mysteriously missed twice. A complaint appeared about my mailbox flag being improperly angled. A landscaping crew showed up unannounced to trim overgrown hedges that Walter himself had planted and I tended for 30 years. Each incident, alone, was small enough to dismiss as coincidence or bureaucratic clumsiness. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized instantly from decades managing classroom bullies. The slow, deliberate campaign of a person determined to make someone's life uncomfortable enough that they simply give up and leave. I refused to give Deborah that satisfaction. I redirected the landscaping crew, politely called the trash company myself, and straightened my mailbox flag with something close to defiance. If she wanted a war of attrition, she'd chosen the wrong opponent. I had raised teenagers and survived worse. Ruth noticed the pattern too, dropping by more often, bringing casseroles and gossip in equal measure. "She's doing this to others, Ruth said one afternoon. The Alvarez family got a warning about their daughter's wheelchair ramp being unsightly. Their daughter is 9. Margaret. 9 years old. That detail sat heavy with me for days. This wasn't simply about Dean, or me, or one contested parking rule. This was about a woman who had confused authority with ownership, who saw every neighbor's difference, disability, motorcycle, garden gnome, as a personal affront requiring correction. I started keeping careful notes, dates and details of every strange incident, every neighbor's whispered complaint, every board decision that seemed to bend unnaturally in Deborah's favor. Walter always said the quietest people in any room usually see the most. I intended to prove him right. Dean, healing well now, started coming by more regularly, sometimes bringing his riding buddies from the Iron Guardians, retired veterans, mostly gruff and kind in equal measure, who fixed my gutters one Saturday without being asked and refused any payment beyond coffee and pie. Deborah's newsletter that week included a not-so-subtle paragraph about concerning increases in unauthorized vehicle traffic on certain residential streets, potentially linked to organized groups. I laughed out loud reading it, organized groups, as though 5 retired men fixing an old woman's gutters constituted a conspiracy. The neighborhood, though, was starting to split. Some residents, frightened by Deborah's steady drumbeat of vague warnings, began eyeing Dean's motorcycle with suspicion again. Others, having actually met him, rolled their eyes at each new newsletter and grew increasingly vocal in their frustration with Deborah's tactics. At the next board meeting, a new face appeared, a lawyer named Preston Okafor, hired, turned out, by the Iron Guardians Charity Foundation to formally review the HOA's recent pattern of targeted enforcement actions. Deborah's face, when he introduced himself, went noticeably pale. We've received several complaints from residents alleging selective and retaliatory enforcement of bylaws, Preston said calmly, laying a thin folder on the table. We'd like to formally request access to the board's enforcement records for the past 18 months for review purposes. Deborah stalled, citing privacy concerns, procedural requirements, the need for board discussion in closed session. Preston simply nodded, unbothered. Of course. Need. Just know that Ohio's HOA transparency statute requires those records be made available within 30 days of formal request. I watched something shift in Deborah that night, a crack widening beneath her polished surface. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw not just anger in her eyes, but something closer to fear, the particular fear of someone realizing they might actually be caught. Fran Doyle approached me again after that meeting, more urgent this time. Margaret, I need to talk to you somewhere private. Not here. We agreed to meet at my kitchen table the following afternoon. And something in Fran's tense, hurried walk to her car told me this mattered greatly. Fran arrived the next day with a canvas tote bag full of printed spreadsheets, hands trembling slightly as she spread them across my table. I've been the treasurer for 3 years, she said. Lately the landscaping invoices have been strange. Different amounts, inconsistent work descriptions. She pointed to a column of numbers. Look here. There's 4 seasonal maintenance in January. Nobody does seasonal maintenance in January in this climate. Margaret. There's snow on the ground. I think Deborah's been funneling reserve funds somewhere they shouldn't go. I sat very still, absorbing this, the pieces of the last several months rearranging themselves into a new and uglier shape. This had never simply been about a motorcycle, or a fine, or a grudge against a kind old woman who'd helped a stranger during a storm. Why are you telling me this? I asked gently, though I already suspected the answer. Fran's eyes welled up. Because I'm scared of her, and because what she did to you and Dean was wrong, and because I think if I don't say something now, I never will. I promised Fran I'd help her however I could, that we'd move carefully, methodically, the way Walter always taught me to handle anything important. Gather every fact first, then act. Never the reverse. We agreed to keep documenting quietly until Preston's records request forced everything into daylight. Meanwhile, Deborah's harassment campaign, rather than slowing, accelerated. A private investigator, hired by the HOA under vague community safety concerns, began photographing my property, Dean's motorcycle, even Fran's car parked outside my house during our meetings. It felt less like bureaucracy now and more like war. I confronted Deborah directly one afternoon at the mailboxes, unable to hold my tongue any longer. Why are you doing this, Deborah? What did I ever do to you besides help a dying man off my porch steps? Her mask slipped for just a moment, something raw underneath it. You made me look weak, she said quietly, almost to herself. In front of the whole board. In front of everyone. Or out of nothing. And you undermined it in front of everyone. Over some stranger with a motorcycle. I won't let that stand. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. And somehow the saddest. This had never been about safety. Or bylaws. Or property values. It had been about one moment of public humiliation that Deborah simply would not, allow herself to forgive or move past. I told her, as gently as I could manage given everything, that being questioned once in a meeting wasn't weakness, and that turning an entire community against a wounded veteran to soothe her own pride was the actual failure here. She walked away without responding. Jaw tight, eyes wet. That should have been a turning point. I thought. A moment of honesty that might soften things, lead somewhere more human. Instead, within 2 days, Deborah escalated further than I ever imagined she would, moving from petty bureaucratic harassment into something considerably darker and more dangerous. A letter arrived, this time from an actual attorney representing the HOA, alleging that Dean's presence on my property constituted a pattern of behavior consistent with unauthorized subletting, and threatening a formal lien against my house if the situation wasn't resolved within 14 days. I read that letter 3 times before the shock fully settled. Deborah wasn't just trying to embarrass me anymore, or inconvenience Dean. She was trying, quite literally, to take my house, the home Walter and I built our whole life inside, the home I planned to die in. Claire drove down from Denver that same night, no longer willing to stay on the sidelines. She sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, laptop open, researching HOA lien law, calling lawyer friends, her fury a controlled, focused thing that reminded me powerfully of her father. "Mom, this is insane," she said. "A lien over a bylaw dispute that's already been resolved twice? This isn't legal. This is intimidation." I agreed, though something in me, some tired part, wondered how much fight I truly had left in me against someone so relentlessly determined. Dean showed up the next morning, furious in a quiet, controlled way that felt somehow more dangerous than shouting would have. "This ends now," he said. "I'm not going to let her destroy your home over something that happened because I crashed my bike in a blizzard." I told him this wasn't his fault, that Deborah's cruelty was Deborah's alone to answer for, not his to carry. He nodded, but I could see the guilt sitting heavy on him anyway. The particular weight veterans carry when they feel responsible for harm they never intended to cause. Preston Okafor, when I called him that afternoon, was unsurprised but visibly angry on my behalf. "This is retaliatory and almost certainly illegal," he said. "Liens require documented, board-approved violations with proper notice periods. I'll have a cease and desist filed by end of day. Don't sign anything. Margaret," I promised him I wouldn't. Able to sleep, I sat at Walter's old desk and reread his bylaw binder one final time, searching for anything else that might help. Any forgotten clause buried in 30-year-old paper that might turn this fight decisively in my favor. I found something I hadn't noticed before, a founder's protection clause, granting original developers and their direct heirs lifetime exemption from certain enforcement actions, provided they maintained residency. Walter had written it himself, decades ago, perhaps never imagining his widow would one day need it. I photocopied the page with trembling hands, feeling something between vindication and grief. Walter had protected me, quietly, from beyond the grave, without either of us ever knowing it would matter. I allowed myself to cry for a few minutes, then wiped my eyes and kept reading. The next board meeting was scheduled in 5 days, and Preston suggested we save this discovery for maximum effect, rather than tipping our hand early. Let her keep making mistakes, he said. The more aggressive she gets now, the worse this looks when everything comes out at once. I agreed, though waiting felt agonizing. In the meantime, Fran continued quietly gathering financial records, growing more confident each day, emboldened by the knowledge that she wasn't fighting Deborah alone anymore. Ruth organized a small but growing group of neighbors increasingly uncomfortable with the HOA's direction. Even the Hendersons, once fined for their kiddie pool, came forward with their own story, a similar retaliatory lien threat 2 years earlier, quietly settled after they paid an unnecessary compliance fee rather than fight it. Deborah's pattern, was neither new nor isolated to me. 5 days felt endless, each one bringing some new small indignity, another photograph taken of my property, another vague warning letter, another neighbor pulled aside and warned about associating with problematic elements. Deborah was tightening every screw she could reach, unaware the whole machine was about to break. The night before the meeting, Dean showed up at my door, serious in a way I hadn't seen before. "There's something you should know before tomorrow," he said. "One of my club brothers works security at the county records office. He found something." I invited him in, heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Dean sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Fran had spread her spreadsheets weeks earlier, and told me something that reframed everything I thought I understood about Deborah Whitcomb's crusade against me. "Tyler's been riding with an unaffiliated motorcycle crew 2 counties over," Dean said. "Not us. Not the Iron Guardians. A rougher outfit, actual legal trouble. A few members with real records. He's been keeping it hidden from his mother for over a year now." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Deborah's obsessive fear of motorcycles, her relentless campaign against Dean, wasn't really about me or bylaws or property values at all. It was displaced panic. A mother terrified of losing control over a son already slipping quietly out of her grasp. "She's been punishing you for something she can't control in her own house," Dean said quietly. I sat with that, feeling something shift from anger toward a complicated, uncomfortable pity. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It simply explained the shape of it. Finally, after months of confusion, I didn't sleep much that night, turning everything over: the bylaw exemption, Fran's spreadsheets, Preston's cease and desist, and now this new, sad truth about Tyler. Tomorrow's meeting, I realized, wasn't going to be a small procedural dispute anymore. It was going to be a reckoning. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity when I arrived, word having spread through the neighborhood grapevine that something significant was coming. Preston sat near the front with his folder. Fran sat rigid at the treasurer's table, spreadsheets organized neatly beside her water glass, hands still trembling slightly. Deborah opened the meeting with unusual briskness, clearly eager to move past any lingering business toward whatever agenda item she prepared next. "First," she said, "an update on the Ellison property lien. Given continued non-compliance, the board recommends proceeding with formal collection action." I stood, calmly, and asked to be recognized before any vote. Deborah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she gestured for me to proceed, perhaps assuming I'd simply plead my case again. Easily dismissed as before. She had no idea what was coming, and for once, neither did I fully. Before this board votes on seizing my home, I said, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest, I'd like to submit evidence of a Founder's Protection Clause, written by my late husband Walter Ellison, one of Cedar Ridge's original developers, exempting direct heirs from such enforcement. I placed the photocopied page on the table. Preston stood immediately, formally entering it into record, noting for the minutes that any lien proceeding against a protected founder's residence without board acknowledgement of this clause would constitute a clear, documented violation of established property law. Deborah's composure, already thin, began visibly fraying. That clause is decades old, likely superseded. She started, but Fran interrupted, uncharacteristically firm. It's never been formally repealed, Deborah. Same as the emergency shelter provision. You can't selectively enforce bylaws you haven't bothered to properly update. A murmur rolled through the crowd, sympathetic now, clearly turning. Deborah tried to regain control, rapping her gavel sharply. This is a distraction from tonight's agenda. We'll table the Founder's Clause for legal review and proceed with... Actually, Preston interjected calmly. There's more to discuss first. He opened his folder and, with quiet, devastating precision, began reading aloud a summary of financial irregularities uncovered in the HOA's landscaping and maintenance accounts over the past 18 months. Invoices for services never rendered, payments routed to a company with no verifiable business address. The room fell utterly silent, the particular silence of an entire community realizing, in real time, that something much larger than a bylaw dispute had been happening beneath their noses. Deborah's face drained of color, her hands gripping the podium's edge like it was the only solid thing left. These are unverified allegations, she stammered, the polish finally, completely gone from her voice. I won't be ambushed like this in a public meeting. Preston, unmoved, simply replied that the records had already been formally requested under state transparency statutes. Ambush or not, Fran stood then, visibly shaking but determined. I'm the treasurer. For years. Something changed after Deborah became president. I have copies of every suspicious invoice, dated and documented. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. The crowd's reaction shifted from shock into something sharper, angrier. Neighbors who had trusted Deborah with their monthly dues now realizing that trust may have been badly, systematically betrayed. Someone near the back shouted, "How much are we talking about? Exactly?" Fran's answer landed like a stone. Best estimate, based on what I've cross-referenced so far, somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 over the past year and a half. Gasps rippled through the clubhouse. Deborah opened her mouth to respond, but nothing coherent came out, her carefully constructed authority crumbling in real time. This meeting is adjourned, she announced abruptly, banging the gavel hard enough to crack the wooden podium slightly. But nobody moved. Passive audience to something closer to a jury, unwilling to simply disperse now that the truth had finally cracked open before them. Sit down. Deborah, someone called from the back. I recognized the voice as Mr. Abernathy's, the wind chime man she'd once threatened over a noise complaint. "We're not adjourning." A chorus of agreement rose up around him, louder, more insistent than I'd ever heard from this crowd. Preston raised a hand for quiet, ever the calm professional amid the storm he'd helped uncover. "I'd suggest the board formally suspend Deborah Whitcomb's authority pending a full independent financial audit, effective immediately, in accordance with the association's own governing bylaws regarding officer misconduct." A vote was called, hastily but properly, board members visibly shaken but unwilling now to shield Deborah any further. The motion passed nearly unanimously, only one abstention. Deborah stood frozen at the podium for a long moment before finally, wordlessly, walking out into the cold night alone. I sat in the stunned aftermath, Claire's hand finding mine under the table, Fran quietly wiping tears of relief and exhaustion from her face. Dean, standing near the back with his Iron Guardians brothers, caught my eye and offered a small, tired, grateful nod across the crowded room. It should have felt like the end. It wasn't. Not quite yet. Deborah Whitcomb, I would soon learn, was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly, even when the evidence against her sat plainly on the table for an entire community to see and judge for themselves. 2 days later, Deborah requested an emergency legal injunction, attempting to block the audit entirely, claiming procedural violations in how the suspension vote had been conducted. Preston fought it calmly, methodically, filing the necessary countermotions while Fran continued organizing documentation for the state investigators now involved. The county, alerted by Preston's formal complaint, opened a preliminary fraud inquiry into the HOA's finances. An investigator named Detective Marisol Reyes began interviewing board members, myself included, sitting across my kitchen table asking careful, precise questions while sipping the tea I'd instinctively offered. "We're looking closely at a landscaping company called Greenscape Solutions," Detective Reyes told me. "Registered address traces back to a P.O. box owned by a Tyler Whitcomb. Same last name as your former HOA president. Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say, Mrs. Ellison?" I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the last piece of this ugly puzzle click quietly into place. Deborah hadn't simply been persecuting me out of wounded pride over one embarrassing meeting. She'd been funding her struggling son through the very community she claimed to protect. The irony sat heavy and bitter. A woman who'd built her entire public identity around order, propriety, and rule-following had been quietly, systematically breaking the biggest rule of all, using neighbors' trust and monthly dues to bail out the very son whose motorcycle crew she'd condemned so publicly. Deborah, cornered now on multiple fronts, grew increasingly desperate. She showed up at my house unannounced one evening. No makeup, hair disheveled, a version of herself I'd genuinely never seen before. "Please," she said, "tell them to stop. Just make this go away." I felt something complicated looking at her. Not quite pity, not quite satisfaction. Something uncomfortably in between. "Deborah, I never wanted any of this," I said honestly. "You built this fight yourself, meeting by meeting, letter by letter. I only ever wanted to help a dying man off my porch." She left without responding, tail lights disappearing down Larkspur Lane into the dark, and I stood on my porch for a long time afterward, feeling the strange, heavy weight of watching someone's carefully constructed world finally completely collapse under the accumulated weight of its own dishonesty. The following week brought the audit's preliminary findings. Worse even than Fran's initial estimate, nearly $71,000 in misappropriated reserve funds over 2 years, routed through fake invoices to Tyler's shell company, some of it apparently used to cover his crew's legal fees. Detective Reyes formally charged Deborah with embezzlement and financial fraud, charges that carried, given the amount involved, the real possibility of significant prison time. Tyler faced separate charges related to the fraudulent business filings, a bitter irony given how hard Deborah had worked to protect his reputation. The community, once so easily swept along by Deborah's confident authority, now buzzed with a different energy entirely, disbelief curdling slowly into anger, then into something almost like grim, exhausted relief that the truth had finally, fully surfaced after so many months of quiet, targeted cruelty. Claire stayed another week to help me sort through the emotional wreckage, both of us marveling quietly at how quickly an entire community's trust could be manipulated, and how long it sometimes took for that manipulation to unravel even when the truth was hiding in plain sight. I visited Fran one afternoon to thank her properly, bringing a pie the way I do for anyone who's earned my gratitude. She looked lighter than I'd seen her in months, the fear finally draining from her shoulders now that the truth belonged to everyone, not just to her alone. I almost didn't say anything, she admitted over tea. I was so scared of her. Scared of what she might do. I told her that courage rarely feels brave in the moment. It usually just feels like doing the next right, terrified thing anyway. Dean's leg had fully healed by then, though he still favored it slightly on cold mornings. A small permanent souvenir of the blizzard that had first brought us together as unlikely friends. He came by often now, sometimes with his club brothers, sometimes alone, always welcome at my table. You know, he said one evening, sitting on my porch swing where he'd first collapsed months earlier. Most people would have called an ambulance and washed their hands of the whole thing once I was stable. You went to war for a stranger. That's not nothing. Margaret, I told him it never felt like a choice. Not really, just the thing Walter would have expected of me. The thing any decent person does when someone's bleeding on their porch steps in a blizzard. Rules and consequences be damned until the storm has fully passed. The Iron Guardians organized a small community fundraiser that spring, partly to thank the neighbors who'd stood by Dean and me, partly to help rebuild the HOA's depleted reserve fund honestly, transparently, the way it should have been managed all along before Deborah's arrival poisoned everything. Nearly the entire street turned out, including families who'd once eyed Dean's motorcycle with suspicion, now cheerfully buying raffle tickets and homemade lemonade from veterans they'd finally taken the time to actually meet. Fear, I'd learned, dissolves remarkably fast once real people replace imagined threats. Deborah's house sat dark and empty most days now, a moving truck appearing eventually to quietly haul away the life she'd built there. She never said goodbye to anyone, never apologized, simply vanished from Cedar Ridge the way storms sometimes do, abruptly, leaving visible damage behind. I heard through the grapevine, months later, that she'd accepted a plea deal, restitution payments, probation, community service, the embezzlement charges reduced in exchange for full cooperation against a separate, larger fraud ring Tyler's crew turned out to be tangled up with in a neighboring county. Tyler, interestingly, cooperated fully with investigators once separated from his mother's influence. providing information that helped dismantle part of that larger criminal operation. Detective Reyes told me, off the record, that he seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. Exhausted by years of hiding and lying, the new HOA board, elected that autumn, looked remarkably different from Deborah's younger, more collaborative, genuinely interested in listening rather than dictating. Fran was elected president unanimously, a fitting, quiet triumph for the woman who'd once been too frightened to speak up in a crowded room. Ruth threw a small celebration dinner when the new bylaws passed, formally reaffirming both the emergency shelter provision and the Founders Protection Clause, this time with unanimous, enthusiastic support rather than reluctant tolerance. I raised my glass of sweet tea and thought of Walter, quietly proud. Claire visited more often after that spring, no longer worried about leaving her mother alone in a hostile neighborhood, instead genuinely enjoying the warmer, more connected community. Cedar Ridge had slowly become in Deborah's absence. My grandchildren learned to ride Dean's old spare motorcycle helmet around the yard. Dean became a fixture at holiday gatherings, family dinners, ordinary Sunday afternoons on my porch swing. The stranger who'd nearly died on my porch steps had somehow become, over the course of one difficult year, something very close to the family I hadn't realized I still needed. I still keep Walter's old bylaw binder on the hall closet shelf, worn now from constant use, its yellowed pages full of small handwritten notes that turned out to matter far more than either of us ever imagined when he first wrote them decades ago, quietly protecting a future he'd never see. Sometimes I think about how close it all came to going differently. If the phone lines had worked that night, if Deborah had simply let the fine slide, if Fran had stayed too frightened to speak up, if Dean's leather vest had told a different, less redeemable story. But it didn't go differently. It needed to. Slow and painful and finally, deeply satisfying, the way real justice usually does, not through grand dramatic gestures, but through patient, stubborn, ordinary people refusing to simply let unfairness win because it wore a confident smile. The porch where Dean nearly died still creaks the same way it always has. The same swing where Walter used to read the paper every Sunday morning. I sit there most evenings now, tea in hand, watching the street I fought so hard to keep feeling like home. Cedar Ridge Estates isn't perfect. Not by any means. There are still minor disputes. Still the occasional overzealous letter about hedge heights or holiday decorations left up too long. But the fear is gone now. The particular cold fear of a community weaponized against its own gentlest members. Deborah Whitcomb taught me something. In the end, despite everything, that power without accountability curdles quickly into cruelty. That kindness always looks foolish right up until the moment it's proven wise. And that the quietest people in any room are usually the ones worth watching most carefully. I helped a stranger off my porch steps during a blizzard because it was the right thing to do. Nothing more complicated than that. I never expected it to cost me nearly everything. And I never expected, in the end, for it to give me back so very much more. The Iron Guardians still stop by every winter now, checking on the elderly residents up and down Larkspur Lane before storms roll in. A small tradition born entirely from one snowy night and one old woman's refusal to close her door on a bleeding stranger. Fran runs the HOA with a transparency Deborah never understood, publishing every financial statement, welcoming every question, proving month after month that a community can hold real order without needing fear to enforce it. Cedar Ridge feels, for the first time in years, genuinely peaceful again. I think Walter would have liked Dean, would have appreciated the particular quiet steadiness he brings to a Sunday dinner table. The way he always insists on doing the dishes. The way he still, months later, thanks me every single time he walks through my front door. My grandchildren call him Uncle Dean now. Without anyone officially deciding that should happen, it simply happened, the way genuine family sometimes assembles itself from unlikely pieces. A blizzard and a bylaw dispute somehow becoming the strange, unexpected foundation of something lasting and real. On the anniversary of that storm, we gather now every year. Ruth, Fran, the Hendersons, Dean and his Iron Guardians brothers, Claire and the grandchildren, a small, imperfect, hard-won family gathered on my porch. Celebrating the night everything nearly fell apart and somehow, instead, came together. I keep the framed, rescinded fine notice on my hallway wall still. Right beside a photo from that first fundraiser. Right beside Walter's wedding photo. A small, strange museum of one difficult year. A reminder that standing quietly firm sometimes matters more than shouting ever could. People sometimes ask if I regret it, the fight, the stress, the months of harassment and fear before everything finally turned. I tell them the truth every time. I drag that stranger off my porch steps again in a heartbeat. Blizzard or no blizzard. Rules or no rules. It was nearly a year to the day after that first blizzard when the final piece of Deborah's story reached me. Delivered by Detective Reyes over coffee at my kitchen table. The same table where Fran had once spread her trembling spreadsheets in fear of being discovered. "There's something else you should know," Reyes said carefully, setting down her mug. The financial trail went back further than we initially thought. Deborah wasn't the first HOA president to run this scheme. She learned it from someone. Someone who groomed her for the role specifically. I felt a chill settle over me despite the warm kitchen. "Who?" I asked. Reyes hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "The previous HOA president. 3 terms back. A woman named Carol Iverson. She still owns 3 rental properties in this development under an LLC. The name meant nothing to me directly, but something about the pattern felt sickeningly familiar. Another controlling figure. Another quiet campaign of fear and selective rule enforcement. Another community slowly bent to one woman's will long before Deborah ever picked up a gavel of her own. Carol mentored Deborah when she first joined the board," Reyes continued. "Taught her the playbook, how to weaponize bylaws, how to isolate dissenters, how to make good people too tired or too scared to keep fighting. Deborah wasn't the beginning. She might not even be the end." I sat with that revelation for a long time after Reyes left. The porch swing creaking gently in the evening breeze. Walter's old binder open on the table beside me. Somewhere out there, apparently, a whole quiet lineage of Karens had been passing down cruelty like an inheritance. I called Fran that night, told her what I'd learned. Her voice went sharp with familiar resolve. "Then we make sure it stops here," she said. "New bylaws, term limits, mandatory financial transparency audits every single year, regardless of who's president. We build something they can't quietly corrupt again." We spent the following weeks drafting exactly that, a complete overhaul of Cedar Ridge's governing structure, designed specifically to prevent any future Deborah, any future Carol, from ever again turning a homeowners association into a private kingdom built on fear and buried financial theft. The proposal passed overwhelmingly at the next general meeting, nearly every resident showing up to vote. A turnout Cedar Ridge hadn't seen in over a decade. Something had shifted permanently in this community, an awakening that no future president, however charming or controlling, would easily undo again. Detective Reyes kept me updated over the following months as Carol Iverson's own investigation quietly unfolded, uncovering an even larger pattern: 3 separate HOAs across 2 counties. Each one bled slowly of reserve funds. Each one led by a president Carol had personally recruited and trained. It read almost like a strange, sprawling criminal franchise, disguised entirely behind bake sales and bylaw newsletters. An entire network of small-town control built on the same simple formula. Find someone hungry for authority, teach them fear as a management tool, then quietly profit from the chaos. Carol was eventually charged as well. Months later, the case slower and more complicated given how carefully she'd insulated herself through LLCs and shell companies over the years. I felt, watching it unfold from a careful distance, a strange sense of closure I hadn't expected to need. Dean, reading about it all in the local paper one Sunday morning on my porch, shook his head slowly. You really did pull a thread that unraveled the whole sweater, didn't you? I told him I'd only meant to save one stranger's life during one bad storm. Sometimes that's all it takes, he said. One person doing the right thing when it's inconvenient, when it's risky, when it would be so much easier just to look away. I thought of my mother's old porch light again, the one always left burning for anyone lost. That summer, the new HOA board organized a proper memorial for the original founders, myself included, unveiling a small bronze plaque near the community entrance honoring Walter Ellison's original vision for Cedar Ridge, a place built on genuine neighborliness, not fear disguised as order. I stood there at the unveiling, Claire's hand in mine, Dean and Fran and Ruth beside me, and felt Walter's presence more strongly than I had in years, as though some small, stubborn piece of his careful handwriting had finally, fully protected the community he'd helped build decades earlier. The plaque reads simply, "Built on kindness. Protected by those who refused to look away." Fran insisted on that final line specifically, over some board members' objections that it felt too pointed. I told her it felt exactly right, precisely as pointed as it needed to be. Deborah, from what I understand, completed her community service at a homeless shelter 2 counties over, an assignment Detective Reyes told me she'd initially resisted fiercely before. Apparently, something in the work eventually began to soften her, however slightly, however late in coming that softening was. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her, and I've decided that's all right. That forgiveness isn't actually owed simply because enough time has passed. What I do know is that Cedar Ridge healed, slowly and honestly, in ways that wouldn't have been possible without her downfall. Tyler, last I heard, had entered a diversion program, cooperating fully with prosecutors, working construction 2 towns over, trying quietly to rebuild something like an honest life. Dean mentioned once that his club had even offered Tyler mentorship. A strange, generous olive branch given everything that had happened. He's not his mother, Dean said simply, when I raised an eyebrow at that particular kindness. Kids inherit plenty of things they never chose. Doesn't mean they're stuck carrying it forever. If somebody's willing to show them a different way to be a man. I thought about that for a long time afterward. How easily this whole story could have hardened all of us permanently, me, Fran, Dean, even Ruth, into people who trusted no one, expected the worst, closed our doors against every stranger who might someday need shelter from a storm. Instead, somehow, the opposite had happened. Cedar Ridge became, gradually, the community it had always claimed to be on its optimistic little welcome sign. Neighbors who actually knew each other, checked on each other, opened their doors rather than closing them against imagined threats and manufactured fear. The following winter brought another hard storm, nowhere near as severe as the original blizzard, but enough to knock out power along Larkspur Lane for several hours. I watched from my window as neighbors moved between houses, checking on each other, exactly the way no one had thought to a year before. Dean and his club rode through that evening despite the weather, distributing blankets and battery lanterns to elderly residents up and down the street. A small tradition now fully cemented into Cedar Ridge's winter routine, born entirely from one night nobody had ever expected to matter so much. I sat on my porch that evening, wrapped warm despite the cold, watching motorcycles and flashlights move carefully through the falling snow, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so fully at 75 years old: genuine, uncomplicated pride in the community I'd fought so hard to protect. Ruth joined me on the porch swing, 2 mugs of hot cocoa in hand, watching the same quiet scene. "You know," she said, "if Deborah could see this right now, I wonder what she'd think." I told her I honestly wasn't sure, and that maybe it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: the light in my window, the warmth in my kitchen, the family assembled from unlikely pieces, the community finally rebuilt on something sturdier than fear. Whatever Deborah thought, wherever she was now, none of it could touch what we'd built in her absence. Detective Reyes closed her file on Cedar Ridge's case that spring, stopping by one last time to update me personally. "Full restitution's been ordered," she said. "Reserve funds being repaid over the next 3 years. Carol's case is still ongoing, but yours is officially closed, Mrs. Ellison." I thanked her for everything, for taking Fran's quiet fear seriously, for following the thread all the way to its uncomfortable, sprawling end. "You did the hard part," she said, standing to leave. "Most people wouldn't have dragged a bleeding stranger off their porch in a blizzard." I told her, the way I'd told everyone who asked over the past year, that it never felt like a choice at all, just the obvious, immediate thing any decent person does when someone's dying on their doorstep, regardless of what rules or consequences might follow after the storm passes. The final board meeting of that difficult year fell on the 1-year anniversary of the blizzard itself. A coincidence nobody had planned, but everyone quietly noticed. Fran opened with a full financial report, transparent to the penny, met with warm applause rather than the old anxious silence. I stood to speak near the meeting's end, something I hadn't planned to do but felt, suddenly, necessary. "A year ago tonight," I said, "I opened my door during a blizzard and found a stranger bleeding on my porch steps. I want to thank this community for what came after." I looked around the packed clubhouse, Fran at the treasurer's table, Ruth in her usual seat, Dean and his club brothers near the back, Claire visiting again for the occasion, the Hendersons, the Alvarez family, Mr. Abernathy and his wind chimes, all of U.S. survivors of the same storm. "We could have let fear win," I continued. "We could have let one person's cruelty become the whole story. Instead, we chose each other, slowly, imperfectly, the way real communities actually do it. That's worth celebrating tonight, I think, more than any bylaw or budget report. The room broke into applause, warmer than any I'd heard in that clubhouse before, and I sat back down feeling Walter's absence and presence in equal measure, wishing he could see this, suspecting somehow that he already had, quietly, from whatever vantage point the departed keep watch from. Dean walked me home that night under a clear, star-heavy sky. No blizzard this time, just ordinary quiet winter air and the comfortable silence of old friends. Same porch, he said, glancing at the steps where he'd once collapsed, bleeding into a stranger's unexpected kindness a year before. Same porch, I agreed, though it's held up better than either of us, considering everything it's witnessed this past year. He laughed, the easy laugh of a man finally, fully at peace in a place that had once treated him as a threat rather than a neighbor worth knowing. I think often about how close everything came to going differently that first night. If I'd hesitated at the door, if I'd remembered the guest policy before remembering my own conscience, if fear had won out over the simple, old-fashioned instinct to help someone who was suffering. But I didn't hesitate, and fear didn't win. Not that night and not in all the difficult months that followed. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with anger or vengeance, but simply with patience, documentation, and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty rewrite what actually happened. Deborah Whitcomb wanted a community built on fear, obedience, and her own unquestioned authority. What she got, in the end, was a community that learned exactly how strong it could become once enough ordinary people decided, quietly and together, that they were simply done being afraid. I still keep a candle by my window most winter evenings, an old habit from my mother that turned out to matter more than I ever expected. You never know, after all, who might be out there in the dark, cold and lost, needing nothing more than an open door. Cedar Ridge Estates isn't a perfect place, and it never will be. No community made of real, flawed, ordinary people ever is. But it's honest now, transparent now, kind now in ways it wasn't before. One blizzard, one bleeding stranger, and one very stubborn old woman changed everything. Fran still serves as president, re-elected twice now, running the tightest, most transparent board Cedar Ridge has ever known. She keeps a small framed photo of that first spreadsheet-covered kitchen table on her office wall, a reminder of the fear she once had to push through to matter. Ruth's grandchildren call Dean's motorcycle the good bike now, distinguishing it proudly from the imaginary dangerous ones Deborah once warned the whole neighborhood about. Children, I've noticed, usually understand truth faster than adults do, once you simply give them the chance to meet it honestly. Claire visits every few months now, no longer anxious about leaving me alone in a hostile place, instead genuinely delighted by how warmly Cedar Ridge has wrapped itself back around her aging mother. My grandchildren race down Larkspur Lane now without a single worried glance from any window. I think about Walter every single day, but especially on quiet evenings like this one. Porch swing creaking gently, tea cooling beside me, the whole difficult, beautiful year settling finally into something like peace. He always said the measure of a person shows plainest when the cost is real. I paid that cost, fully, over one long difficult year. Fines, threats, harassment, the very real fear of losing the home we built together. But I'd pay it again, gladly, every single time, for the family I somehow gained in exchange for one stranger's life on a snowy porch. The Iron Guardians named their annual winter charity ride after that first blizzard now, calling it simply the Ellison Run, raising funds every December for families facing housing instability. A small, permanent tribute to one ordinary night that somehow rippled outward into something much larger than itself. I attend every single ride's departure, standing on my porch in my warmest coat, waving as dozens of motorcycles rumble past toward the highway, engines echoing off the mountains the same way they did that first terrible, transformative night, except now the whole street waves along with me. Detective Reyes still checks in occasionally, more friend now than investigator, sharing updates on Carol Iverson's slowly unfolding prosecution, on Tyler's steady progress rebuilding an honest life, on the quiet, satisfying unraveling of a whole small-town system built on fear that finally, fully collapsed under its own weight. Deborah, I'm told, moved out of state entirely after completing her sentence, starting somewhere fresh, somewhere nobody knows her name or her history. I hope, honestly, that wherever she is now, she's finally learned the lesson Cedar Ridge tried so hard, so painfully, to teach her all along. Kindness costs something. Always. That's precisely what makes it matter. I paid dearly for one instinctive act of decency on a blizzard night, and in exchange received a rebuilt community, an honest board, a found family, and the quiet, permanent knowledge that I never once regretted opening that door. Some nights I still hear the wind pick up outside, rattling the same shutters Walter installed decades ago. And I think of that first terrible crash against my porch railing, the blood dark against the snow, the choice that felt like no choice at all in the moment it mattered most. I made the right choice that night, whatever it eventually cost me. I'd make it again tomorrow, and every night after that. For as long as I'm the woman standing on this porch with a light burning steady in the window, waiting for whoever might need it next. Cedar Ridge Estate stands today exactly the way Walter always hoped it would, imperfect, occasionally squabbling over hedge heights and holiday decorations, but fundamentally, finally decent, built on neighbors who show up for each other rather than neighbors who weaponize small rules against each other's basic humanity. My porch swing still creaks the same familiar way it always has, holding steady through every storm this old house has weathered, through everything that happened after one blizzard, one bleeding stranger, and one quiet old woman who simply refused to close her door when it mattered most of all. People still ask me, sometimes, if I was scared that night, dragging a stranger through the snow with no ambulance coming and no idea what would follow. I tell them the truth. I wasn't thinking about fear at all. I was only thinking about the light in my window. That light still burns every winter evening now. Walter's old porch tradition carried faithfully forward. A small steady beacon for whoever might someday need it, because kindness, I've learned at 75 years old, is never truly wasted, even when it costs you everything you thought you had to lose. 2 years passed before I finally sat down and wrote all of this out properly, prompted by Claire, who insisted the whole strange saga deserved more than scattered retellings at holiday dinners. She said other families might need to hear it, other quiet people underestimated by their own neighbors. I wasn't sure at first. The lean threat, the photographs of my property, the particular loneliness of being disbelieved by people I'd waved to for years. But Claire was right. In the end, the way she usually is about things that matter. Writing it down meant reliving the fear too. Not just the eventual victory. The nights I lay awake wondering if I'd lose the house Walter and I built together. The mornings I braced myself for whatever new small cruelty the mail might bring. That fear was real, and honest, and mine. But so was everything that came after. Fran's trembling hands steadying over time into confident leadership. Dean's crooked, grateful smile becoming a fixture at my kitchen table. An entire neighborhood slowly remembering what it actually meant to be neighbors instead of enforcers of somebody else's anxious need for control. I've come to believe that stories like this matter precisely because they're so ordinary underneath the drama. A fine here, a warning letter there. Small humiliations most people simply absorb and move past rather than fight. Deborah counted on exactly that exhaustion. She simply hadn't counted on Walter's old binder. Sometimes I wonder about all the other Margarets out there. Other quiet widows or wounded veterans or nervous treasurers too frightened to speak up in their own communities. Still living under some smaller version of what Cedar Ridge endured before Fran finally found the courage to spread her spreadsheets on my table. I hope, if nothing else, this story reaches a few of them. I hope it reminds someone that documentation matters, that patience matters, that one honest neighbor willing to keep careful notes can eventually unravel even the most confidently constructed campaign of small-town cruelty, given enough time and enough courage. Dean still teases me sometimes about how calm I stayed through all of it, how I never once raised my voice at Deborah even when she was threatening to take my home. 40 years of third graders. I always tell him, you learn patience or you don't survive the job at all. He laughs every time, though I think he understands, underneath the joke, that patience was never really about temperament. It was about strategy, about refusing to give Deborah the reaction she wanted, about understanding that calm, documented persistence frightens bullies far more than anger ever could. Fran told me recently that new residents moving into Cedar Ridge sometimes hear the story secondhand and ask, half joking, whether the HOA president position comes with a background check now. She laughs and tells them yes. Actually, along with mandatory annual financial audits written directly into the bylaws. We made sure of that. In the end, not just punishing Deborah, but building something sturdier in the wreckage she left behind. Term limits, transparency requirements, an actual appeals process for anyone fined or warned, protections written carefully enough that no future Deborah could easily bend them toward cruelty again. I think that's the part I'm proudest of. Honestly, more than the vindication or the applause at that final board meeting. We didn't just survive Deborah Whitcomb. We built something better in her absence. Something that will hopefully outlast all of us who lived through that difficult, transformative year. Ruth passed away peacefully last spring. In her sleep, in the house she'd lived in for 39 years. The whole street turned out for her memorial. Dean's motorcycle club leading a slow, respectful procession down Larkspur Lane. Exactly the kind of send-off she would have found both moving and mildly hilarious. I miss her terribly. Our tea and casserole afternoons. Her steady warnings about Deborah that I should have taken even more seriously than I did. She never got to see everything that eventually came from that one difficult year. Though I like to think she'd be quietly, thoroughly satisfied by how it all turned out. Life continues here on Larkspur Lane. Mostly ordinary now. Blessedly ordinary. The way a good community should feel most of the time, the occasional squabble over hedge heights, the annual charity ride, holiday potlucks that actually feel warm rather than performative, children playing safely in driveways. I'm 76 now, still living in the house Walter and I built our whole life inside. Still sitting on that same creaky porch swing most evenings. Tea in hand. Candle burning steady in the window through every winter storm that rolls down from the mountains toward Cedar Ridge. Dean stops by most Sundays still. Sometimes with new club members he wants me to meet. Always with that same crooked grateful smile he first offered me from my kitchen floor, bleeding and half-frozen. The night everything between us and this whole community began so unexpectedly. Claire calls every week now. No longer anxious, just genuinely curious about whatever small neighborhood news I have to share. My grandchildren visit every summer, racing their bicycles safely down streets that once felt, briefly, dangerously uncertain, entirely unaware of how close all of this once came to falling apart. I don't know what happened to Deborah after she moved away, and I've made peace, mostly, with never knowing. Some stories simply end without a tidy final chapter for every character involved. What matters is that Cedar Ridge healed, honestly and thoroughly, long after she stopped being part of it. If there's a lesson in all of this, beyond the obvious satisfaction of watching cruelty finally answer for itself, I think it's simply this: kindness is never foolish, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you dearly, even when the people around you insist you should have known better than to open that door. I knew exactly what I was doing when I dragged that bleeding stranger off my porch steps into the warmth of my kitchen. I was doing what Walter would have expected, what my own conscience demanded, what any decent person does when someone else's survival depends entirely on one small, immediate choice. Everything that followed, the fines, the threats, the fear, the slow unraveling of Deborah's carefully hidden fraud, the family I gained in the process, all of it grew from that one simple, unremarkable decision to help a dying stranger during a blizzard. Rules and consequences be damned. I'd make that same choice again tomorrow, without hesitation, exactly as I made it that first terrible, transformative night. The porch light still burns steady in my window every winter evening now, waiting patiently for whoever might someday need it. The same quiet promise my mother once taught me to keep. That's the whole of it. Really, the entire hard-won truth this difficult year finally taught me. Open the door anyway. Help the stranger anyway. Stand quietly, stubbornly firm against whoever tries to punish you for it anyway. The storm always passes eventually. Decency, if you protect it carefully, never does.